All right, so we're recording. Remember, if you have any questions, you can use the raise hand icon that's in the toolbar, little hand icon that's in the main screen, or you can type questions in the chat as well. I monitor both things during our class. So today we're going to have a slightly more lighthearted topic because it's been a long semester. We're in week 10 of 16, so we got 6 weeks left until the end of the fall semester. We've got less than a week left before the 2020 election, which is very stressful for everybody. We're covering a really depressing topic this week, slavery, before the Civil War. So there are recordings up on your Blackboard page. I put up the recording American King Cotton that talks a little bit about why cotton becomes such a major crop to the South and basically causes a rebirth of the system of slavery, which at the time of the American Revolution looked like it was about to die off, but surprise, it's back. Then I also posted an episode of a documentary called Many Rivers to Cross, which is about the period from 1800 to 1860. So it talks about the Second Middle Passage, or the shift of slaves from sort of the East Coast down into what we would today call the Deep South, and their experiences. All right, but just to give us a break, today we're going to talk about sports. We're going to talk about sports in American history up until the Civil War. So we're not going to quite cover the time period of our whole semester, and most of our focus today is going to be between 1800 and 1860. But we're going to talk about sports because sports really, I mean, for a lot of people, sound kind of frivolous to study, right? I mean, if we think about sports, right? If I say sports, like what do you think of? What does your brain associate with sports? What are sports all about for you? Let's ask, what kind of sports do you enjoy personally? For me, I'm a basketball fan. I'm not very good at playing it. I'm more of baseball when it comes to me playing it, but I like watching basketball a lot. Hence, one of my dogs being named after a basketball player, Clyde Drexler from the Houston Rockets and the Portland Trailblazers. What sports do y'all like? Either playing, watching? Wrestling? Yeah, awesome. Are we talking like WWE style or like Greco-Roman style wrestling? So those are very different. Both of which are also very interesting. Greco-Roman, okay. I know in the United States, football, right? American football. In our region in El Paso, soccer, or football as the rest of the world calls it, right, is super important. And a lot of times we tend to think of sports as just kind of like a fun way to pass time, whether we watch it or play it. Mary says, I like to watch football and baseball, but I like to play basketball. Yeah. So baseball, I have to watch it live. Like if I watch it on TV, I fall asleep, but watching it live is really fun. Yeah, so Americans have a lot of different pastimes. And just like today, where your sport of choice probably your personality, but also where you live. Like, for example, hockey is not super popular in El Paso. I mean, we do have like a minor league team, the Rhinos, but I mean, we don't get ice and snow. So most people don't play hockey in their free time. Similarly, the sports we're going to look at today in American history are going to vary by region as well. Although we're going to talk about how some sports like baseball actually do break out from being a regional sport to a nationwide sport. As historians, sports are interesting to us for a couple of reasons. Sports are a way to tell us about how people had fun, you know, what they did in their pastime, what they did on their downtime. Sports also say a lot about our identity, right? Like, for example, Mary likes to watch football. I guarantee you, Mary, you probably have a favorite team, right? What team do you root for? For example, I'm married to a Patriots fan. You may send your condolences. The Packers. Yeah, there are a lot of cheeseheads in El Paso. Yes, the Packers. All right, awesome. So like for college football, I'm a diehard Texas Aggie, but I also root for the Rainbow Warriors because that's where I went to grad school. So we have kind of our own identities kind of shaped around the sports we consume, around the teams that we follow. But the type of sports you participate in also says a lot usually about things like social class and gender. So in other words, sports are another way to tell us about American identity. Sports are also often sort of backdrops for social justice movement, for political protest. I know a lot of times people will say, well, sports and politics shouldn't mix, but the people who say that don't actually study the history of sports, because sports oftentimes is political. And we're going to talk about a couple of examples of that today. So if you're interested, you can actually find quite a lot of textbooks on the history of American sports. I can recommend a few if you really want to do some further reading. They're all really cool. I use a lot of them for this. But for me as a historian, sports is really interesting because it's a fun topic, but again, can tell us really kind of important things about more serious topics. All right, so let's kind of familiarize ourselves with what kinds of sports Americans played in early American history, because the sports landscape looks very different than it does today. So as we mentioned today, sports like football, basketball, soccer would be major sports for Americans. As we're going to talk about in more detail in a second, Native Americans played a lot of sports before the arrival of Europeans. One sport that they played would evolve into what we today know as lacrosse, which is kind of funny because today when you say lacrosse, like you think of like East Coast, like upper middle class white kids. But this was originally a Native American sport. We'll talk about that more in a second. Lots of sports involving animals. Cockfighting, which still is popular in some parts of the world today, even though it's illegal. Bull, bear, and rat baiting. Bull and bear baiting work basically the same way. Both of them involve putting the animal, whether a bull or a bear, in an enclosed space and basically setting dogs on it and kind of placing bets on how long the animal would last before the dogs finish it off, or maybe also place bets on how many dogs would die or be injured, like really bloody sports, not ASPCA approved. This is also the origin of several dog breeds that we still see today. So any dog that has bull in their name, like bulldog and bull terrier, originally come out of this sport, being bred for that. Rat baiting works a little bit differently. Here you have an enclosure full of rats. You drop a dog into it, and then you take bets on how many rats the dog can kill in a certain amount of time. So again, like not sort of things that we would consider enjoyable to watch today, especially if you're an animal lover. And for rat baiting, terriers were probably the most effective breed for this one, because terriers were originally bred to hunt and to manage rodents. I do want to point out I didn't put this on the PowerPoint because it's not ever considered a super popular sport, but there's definitely dog fighting going on where dogs are kind of pit up against each other. This is the origin of breeds like the American Pit Bull. I do want to mention that pit bulls kind of get their fierce reputation in society today because of their origins as a breed for dog fighting, but it's a big but. Breeds can be bred for a purpose, but just because you're trying to breed dogs for a purpose doesn't mean all of them will fulfill that purpose. If I remember the statistic correctly, something like only 25% of any given breed will actually have a strong enough drive to do the task that they're bred for. So for example, The dog on the bed behind me, Joy, is my border collie. Her breed is originally bred to manage or herd sheep, and she probably was a washout because she's a shorter coat border collie. They tend to come from working stock from farms. She definitely does show some instinct, like border collies like to try to direct you or sheep to do what they want by staring at you. She does that when she wants to go to bed, but not strong enough to effectively manage sheep. Sorry, Joy, you are very smart and capable, but I don't think you could handle a herd of sheep. So if you want to read a book about the history of pit bulls, I strongly recommend a book, I think it's just called Pit Bull Cultural History, by Bronwyn Dickey. It's a good read, a little sad in some places. Horse racing is still fairly popular today, right? In El Paso, we have the Sunland, right, racetrack in Sunland, New Mexico. That doesn't evolve too much. It looks very similar today as it did back then. Fox and quail hunting, again, kind of hunting animals for sport, also involves the use of horses and dogs, and mostly done by elite people. A great depiction of fox hunting probably you saw as a kid in the original Disney film Mary Poppins, the animated sequence. Boxing is very popular. We're going to talk about a specific boxing match today. And then baseball becomes invented in the 1800s. And we're going to talk about how baseball very quickly becomes a really popular sport across the nation. So this is just a sampling of some of the sports that people are playing. All right, so sports before Europeans. So before Europeans, as I mentioned, Native Americans are playing sports. Some examples that we have pretty well documented are both the Mayans and the Aztecs in Central America and Mexico constructed these elaborate ball courts to play a game that would have looked like a cross between sort of soccer and dodgeball. They do use their hands. They're playing with these really hard rubber balls. And very often the losers of these ball games would be sacrificed to a god, the exact god depending upon whether it was the Mayans or the Aztecs. With the Aztecs, they're all about the sun god. Lacrosse is a game that is documented being played in the American Southeast by tribes like the Choctaw, tribes also that the Puritans encountered up in New England. Lacrosse at this point was oftentimes called stickball. And similarly, you can see much like lacrosse today, you have a stick with kind of a net at the end of it, and the goal is to kind of pass it and hit it with the stick. You can tell I don't play lacrosse. For Native Americans, sports represent religion and ritual. So in other words, sports was not something you just did to blow off steam or to have some fun, but there were oftentimes religious meanings associated with sports. Please see the Aztec and Mayans engaging in human sacrifice as a result of their ball games. So this is kind of interesting because when Europeans come over in the 1600s to what is North America today, especially the English, they don't see sports as associated with religion. In fact, as we're going to see in just a second, many Puritans, surprise, surprise, opposed sports on the ground of religion. So this meant that the European colonists will see sports in a very different way than the Native Americans do. So sports were actually a hot topic of conversation in England before, just before the Puritans started coming over to New England. The Puritans, as they said, disapproved of sports. They felt that sports were sinful, that they were a distraction from your ultimate goal, which was focusing on your sort of spiritual work as a human being. And they associated sports with Catholic things. For example, still today in Europe, you'll find that feast days that are associated with the birthdays of saints are cause for a festival and celebration, including playing of games and sports. And so Puritans saw the English still playing sports on special occasions as kind of a holdover, a leftover from when England was Catholic. Because remember, England had converted over to the Church of England because of the Protestant Reformation. And remember, that was a big thing for the Puritans, right? They thought the Church of England was still too Catholic. So the Puritans really opposed sports. At the same time, King James, the King of England at that time, really loved sports. And in 1618, he publishes the Book of Sports. This is basically a royal proclamation about sports. So to give you an example, here's a quote from it. Our pleasure likewise is, our good people be not disturbed, letted, or discouraged from any lawful recreation, such as dancing, either of men or women, archery for men, leaping, vaulting, or any other such harmless recreation, nor from having of May games, Whitsun ales, and Morris dances, and the setting up of maypoles and other sports. So basically what King James is saying in this Book of Sports is that he's totally done with sports. He says as long as it's lawful. So here he's probably referring to things like card game or cockfighting where there's gambling. That would be considered unlawful. But he's saying, you know, so long as people aren't breaking any laws, go forth and have fun as much as you want. That it's an important outlet for people to engage in sports. And there's a reason he's publishing it in 1618. Remember from your textbook reading in chapter 2, King James is very much at odds with the Puritans. He had started to crack down on Puritan factions within the Church of England. And so basically, and he's kind of issuing this as a middle finger to the Puritans and their hatred of sports. But he also says that sports, in addition to kind of being like a safety valve for like blowing off some steam, sports also keep you in physically fit condition, and that is an advantage for him as a ruler because then he has a population that's more ready for warfare. Okay, so things like men engaging in archery, that's a skill that they would use in warfare, right? So for him, this is both an FU to the Puritans, but also a recognition that a healthy population makes for better soldiers as necessary in time of war. A little bit later, in the late 1700s, Adam Smith, who you may remember if you've taken an economics class, Adam Smith is a Scottish philosopher who wrote the book Wealth of Nations, which describes the modern system of capitalism. So Adam Smith, in his book, talks about the use of sports as a means of social control. So he said sports were good for the population because it kept them away from religious fanaticism, so extreme religious beliefs because they were busy with sports. He also said that people engaging in sports meant that they had less time to focus on social rebellion, which is really important as we get into the Industrial Revolution, right? That workers who might be discontented, working in terrible conditions for low wages, if they're, spending their off time engaging in sports, they're not planning a revolution. Okay, so for both King James and Adam Smith, sports are useful in kind of managing and preparing your population for what you want them to do, right? Whereas the Puritans saw sports as ultimately a gross distraction from their goal, which was spiritual development. By the way, the Puritans responded to the Book of Sports by burning it. Like you can find pictures if you Google Book of Sports, do an image search, that will be one of the images you find is Puritans holding bonfires and burning this text because they were not happy. All right. So nevertheless, even though the Puritans were not fans of sports, sports did migrate over to the colonies with the migration of English colonists. And just to kind of give you an example of how sports evolved differently depending upon the place, let's talk about sports in New England versus the southern colonies. So in New England, sorry about that, in New England, there are sports. But you go, wait a second, Dr. Esmarker, you just said that Puritans hate sports. We'll get to that. So Puritans punish people who engage in sports in a way they don't like. So one example was a man named Thomas Morton, who set up a maypole. Do you guys know what a maypole is? Raise your hand if you've never heard of a maypole. No idea what it is or what it looks like. Just in case we have somebody who is not viewing the recording, get thee to Google, and I'll go ahead and share this screen as well. So this is what a maypole looks like. So if we go to the images, okay, it's a great example of a maypole. We don't have them very much in the United States anymore. You might find them in some isolated towns, like in Texas. There's a very famous German-American town called Fredericksburg. In central Texas, they still have a maypole they use for festive occasions. But for the most part, maypoles aren't really a huge thing in the United States anymore. Okay. Let's see. Well, let me reload the PowerPoint now. Great. So Thomas Morton built himself a maypole, which the Puritans didn't like. And then he not only built a maypole, but he also invited Native American women and Puritan men to come and gather around the maypole, do some drinking, some dancing. He posted some very lewd rhymes to the maypole, and the Puritans had him arrested and sent back as a prisoner to England. They did not play. Now, the Puritans did allow some sports, but they had to be what they called lawful sports. So what were lawful sports? Lawful sports were activities that had a purpose. So for Puritans, sport for the sake of sport was simple. But if you did something that was a necessary task and you made it sort of a game or a sport, that was okay. So for example, house raising, like building a house, corn husking, ordination of ministers, spinning, quilting bees. These are all considered lawful sports. Try to imagine a color commentary on a quilting bee from ESPN. Maybe. For the Puritans, these are things that have to be done, but that doesn't mean they can't be fun. According to the Puritans, we daily need some respite and diversion, without which we dull our powers. A little intermission sharpens them again, but recreation must tend to glorify God. The scope and end of all recreation is that God may be honored in and by them. Okay. So dancing around a maypole served no logical purpose, so it's bad. But quilting bees, building quilts, keeping you warm, yes, that works. Okay. So for the Puritans, in order to be considered an okay sport, it had to have purpose. This is the exact opposite of sports in the South. So in the South, sports grow widely in popularity because we don't have any Debbie Downer Puritans, condemning them. There's also a distinct kind of get-rich-quick mentality among early colonists, like the Jamestown colonists that we talked about in Chapter 2, right, that kind of encourages this sort of kind of risk-taking or gambling. And the biggest thing is that leisure was considered a sign of freedom. So as time goes on and we move away from indentured servitude and more towards slavery, hard labor or manual labor becomes increasingly associated with blackness and slavery. So what this meant was you getting free time enough to participate in sports was a sign of how free you were as a person. So slaves still played sports, but for them, the sports that they did play on the rare downtime they got on plantations tended to be less formal and sort of gentler. For example, one of the sports textbooks I was looking at talks about how some slaves played an early game version of dodgeball, but unlike today's dodgeball where you get hit, you're out, there wasn't any kind of outs in dodgeball due to kind of that association of removal of a person from the game. That was too close of a parallel to the fact that their friends and family could be sold off and removed from the plantation at any time. So sports is mainly a white preoccupation in the South. The kind of sports you participated in indicated your social status. So for example, elite folks tended to participate in fox and quail hunting. Lower class folks tended to participate in animal sports like cockfighting and bull and bear baiting. One sport that is very popular, but really, again, only participated in by elite folks is horse racing. Now, lower class people enjoyed watching horse racing, but they didn't participate in it to the same extent, partly because horse racing then, like horse racing now, is a big money sport. Quarter horses, which you use in horse racing, are not native to the United States. They had to be imported from England, making them very expensive. You also, when you bred horses, you had to ensure proper breeding, and you also had to sort of catalog their lineage, right? So the meticulous documentation. So it's still, again, very similar to what we see with horse racing today. And if you think of horse racing in a more modern context, big events like the Kentucky Derby, you probably think of elite people, because sort of our stereotypical version of the Kentucky Derby, if we think about it, is people wearing these fancy clothes, these big-ass hats, drinking mint juleps, right, like cocktails, and watching these horses race. So even though lower classes joined in as spectators, they're not the ones who own the horses or making money off of this sport. And speaking of money, lots and lots of people enjoyed gambling, particularly in animal sports where gambling was kind of the point to the sport, because the animals are the ones that are doing the heavy lifting and you're just kind of betting on it. By the way, the colonists in the picture here, this painting is from about 1660, are playing a game called Skittles. Is one of a couple of games that are the early forerunner to what is today bowling. Okay, so you can kind of see the ball, right, the pins, you can kind of see the resemblance here. All right, so Puritans, sports have to have a purpose. Southerners, the purpose of sports is to demonstrate your freedom, right, that you get leisure time. Any questions so far? Are we good? Now I get to the American Revolution. So the American Revolution creates a little bit of a dilemma, because now the colonies are trying to unite so that they can push back Great Britain and win independence. So with the combination of different regions, you have now conflicting ideas about sports. New Englanders who view sports as bad, Southerners who view sports as kind of a key piece of their identity as free white people. So to kind of make the New Englanders happy in this alliance, sports is publicly disavowed. The Continental Congress that meets in 1774 basically bans sports for the duration of the Revolution. They go, look, we've got more important things to worry about. We've got to, deal with this problem with the British. And again, 2 years after that initial edict, right, we declare independence, and it gets even more real. So they're like, we should really kind of ban sports or prohibit sports because that's distracting. Now, sports are still allowed for soldiers. Again, remember, King James saying that sports were a useful way to develop men's bodies for war. Sports are also a useful way for bored soldiers to blow off steam. George Washington, who's the leader of the Continental Army, remember, is from Virginia. He's a fan of horse racing and fox hunting, but he knows that if he allows too much sports, he's going to piss off the New Englanders. So for Washington, he allowed the Continental Army soldiers to play sports so that they could blow off steam in between battles, just so long as they didn't gamble. Okay, so we said, card games or like cockfighting, that's off the table. But if you, want to play Skittles or, tug of war or whatever other kinds of competitions, that's fine. Okay, so kind of shades of New England's lawful sports going on here. So really not much that we can say about sports during the Revolutionary War. After 1800, sports in the United States evolves, and we start to see kind of two different themes if we're looking at the history of sports in the United States. One is that with the Industrial Revolution, sports become a way to recover manliness. By the way, we're going to talk about these in more detail in the next couple of slides. There's a concern that as we become more industrialized, we become more disconnected with nature and disconnected with our bodies, particularly for the middle and upper classes that don't have to do manual labor for their jobs. Okay, so for these guys, sports becomes kind of a way to reclaim masculinity. There's also the parallel track that sports are increasingly used as a way to channel regional differences and regional grievances. That sports become kind of a proxy or a substitute to address conflicts between the North and the South, immigrants and native-born, and in boxing, black versus white. Okay? So that sports becomes, again, kind of like what Adam Smith had talked about, this social safety valve. Okay? So rather than go to war with one another, they would just play sports. Part of the reason that we see sports become more popular in the United States during this time period is the Industrial Revolution advances in technology, particularly communication and transportation, help to spread sports to nationwide audiences. So the telegraph helps easily record and transmit sports scores across the United States. Faster printing and the postal system help to spread sports news, and in fact you see the first sports newspapers during this time period. And then people are brought into contact from different regions at an increasing pace due to steamships and railroads. And so this means that sports are no longer as heavily regionalized as they are. So this is going to be particularly beneficial for the sport of baseball. Baseball is going to, and boxing will be two big examples of sports that go nationwide because of these advances in technology. All right, the invention of baseball. So baseball is a distinctly American game. In fact, some people kind of describe it as America's sport, even more so than football. Baseball comes out of a kids' game called Rounders. Rounders was played by working class kids living in industrialized areas, especially in the Northeast, think like Massachusetts, New York. And in Rounders, again, these are kids playing in cities, so things like what you're using as a bat or a ball or a base are very fluid based on your environment. So like, for example, as a kid, when I played baseball at my house with my sisters, like we made bases out of like different trees in our yard, for example. Those were what we marked as bases. And we used a tennis ball rather than a baseball. And our dog, Ashley, our golden retriever, was our outfielder. So Rounders is, again, a very sort of loose, fluid, adaptable game. Where it turns into baseball is with a man named Alexander Cartwright. So Cartwright realized that he could take the game Rounders and adapt it for adults as a way to, again, kind of encourage physical development amongst the middle and the upper class. So Cartwright will be the guy who creates the first baseball team, the Knickerbockers Baseball Club of New York. He will be the one who standardizes a lot of rules that we still use in baseball today, and also standardizes the uniforms, which we, again, still see very close today to what they were back then. The first organized game of baseball takes place in 1846 in New Jersey. And you can really see in baseball the legacy of this desire to return to a simpler time from industrialization. The fact that the game is played on a green field, that it's not as fast-paced, it's relatively slow, right? That there are specific rules for your conduct, right? That you have to play like a gentleman, all pointed to this desire to kind of remember and romanticize the pre-industrial agrarian past. Now, if you're at all a fan of baseball, you're probably asking, wait a second, I thought Abner Doubleday invented baseball. No, he did not. The idea that Abner Doubleday, who was a former Union general, invented baseball actually comes from Albert Spalding. So Albert Spalding becomes this huge titan in the early history of professional baseball. He is a former player. He becomes a team owner. He becomes rabidly anti-union. That's a story more for history 1302. And Spalding actually was the one who started the story that Abner Doubleday invented the sport during the Civil War, and that the game originated in Cooperstown, New York. There's no evidence to suggest that it's true. There's no evidence to suggest that Doubleday had anything to do with baseball. There's no evidence that he ever visited Cooperstown, New York. So this is a case where, you know, a story gets told by one person, nobody checks kind of for verification, and it becomes kind of popularized. So this is why the Baseball Hall of Fame is in Cooperstown, New York today, because of the story originally told by Spalding. So the Civil War is important to the history of baseball, but it doesn't invent baseball. Instead, what it does is it popularizes and nationalizes it. Because the war throws together soldiers from different backgrounds, different regions, including immigrants, they play baseball as a way, like the Revolutionary soldiers played sports in general, as a way to blow off steam in between battles. And so many people picked up baseball for the first time, especially those outside of the Upper East Coast. They picked up on baseball as a fun game to play on their downtime. In fact, one kind of journal from a Union soldier describes with remorse how they were playing a game of baseball in Alexandria, Texas, and then it got disrupted by rifle fire. They lost their center fielder, who was captured by the enemy, but then he also says, we also lost the only baseball field in Alexandria, Texas. So he was actually more upset about losing the field than he was his comrade. So after the Civil War, baseball becomes far more popular on a nationwide scale, and we start to see the very first stirrings of professional baseball. But again, because that's after the Civil War, we're not going to get into that. If you've never watched it, and if you're a fan of baseball, Ken Burns' excellent series on the history of American baseball is widely available after originally airing on PBS. Now, I mentioned that there were concerns that the Industrial Revolution was making men soft, particularly men in the middle and upper class who increasingly worked in clerical jobs or management that did not require them to exert manual labor. Because as you remember from your reading More Work for Mother, a lot of the home tasks that men used to do were increasingly mechanized, right? So there wasn't even an opportunity for the home chores to kind of build up their muscle strength. One British traveler observing Americans said, every man is born middle-aged in every city of the Union. Athletic games and boulder field sports being unknown, all that is left is chewing and smoking and drinking. Young men made of such materials as I describe are not young men at all. They have no breadth of either their shoulders or their ambitions. Their physical powers are subdued and their mental capability cribbed into narrow limits. So according to him, because these middle and upper class Americans aren't engaging in sports, not only are they physically weak, but he's also equating this to moral weakness, that they're engaging in bad activities like smoking and drinking because they don't have that physical outlet of sports. Oliver Wendell Holmes in 1858 said, "I am satisfied that such a set of black-coated, stiff-jointed, soft-muscled, paste-complexioned youths as we can boast in our American cities never before sprang from the loins of Anglo-Saxon lineage." Ouch. He's basically calling American young men a whole bunch of sissies. So this physical decay being associated with a moral decay leads us to the development of a movement called muscular Christianity. So muscular Christianity is the flip side of the Puritans. So remember, the Puritans said sport was sinful because it was distracting from spiritual development. Muscular Christianity says physical health and good, clean sports were a key to a godly life. So now, sports and physical health are a way to glorify God. Thomas Wentworth Higginson, in his essay Saints and Their Bodies, makes all kinds of claims. For example, he says that Western men had not been properly fit or in shape since the time of ancient Greece. He blames the Catholic Church for glorifying saints who were physically meek and weak. Basically, again, kind of glorifying this lack of physical development and boldness. And he says physical fitness guarantees us against physical degeneracy, and we can risk all the perils: financial crisis, slavery, Romanism, Mormonism, border ruffianism, and New York assassins. So he's saying that if we are physically fit, we are prepared to handle anything that's tossed at us. And I kind of find it funny that he specifically name checks Catholics and Mormons and border ruffians as challenges to the United States. As part of this muscular Christianity movement, we have the creation of the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, that still exists today. Well, it starts in England. The very first location is born in the United States in the city of Boston in 1851. Okay. So, if you ever wondered why the YMCA exists, why Christianity and gyms are compatible, it's because of this muscular Christianity movement. So I'm going to wrap up our talk about sports by talking about two nationwide events that happened in the 1840s that are examples of how sports is oftentimes used to settle conflict in the United States. I'm going to go chronologically here. So the first national sporting event, major national sporting event in the United States history, is the 1845 horse race between Fashion and Peytona. So remember, I said horse racing is popular but a very expensive sport. Fashion, who's the horse from the north, had already had an impressive racing record before this matchup, had already beaten a southern horse by 35 lengths, which, if you're not familiar with horse racing, is a huge blowout. Peytona, who was the horse from the south, had set a record for the highest winning single stakes, having won a race worth $35,000. For context, in today's money, it's a little bit difficult to exactly calculate because if you Google inflation calculator, most inflation calculators only go back to about 1913. But if you use that tool, and again, estimate that the number would be even higher in 1845, that's above $1 million in today's money. So Fashion and Peytona decide to have a matchup. The race, which is held on May 13th, 1845, sees an audience of 100,000 people show up. That's a lot. For context, I went to college at Texas A&M. Kyle Field, which is the football stadium the Aggies play in, was recently renovated, and it now holds 102,000 people. Okay, so that's to give you a context here. This is a lot of people. Tona, the Southern horse, wins the race, but they rematch a few weeks later, and in that race, Fashion wins and Peytona pulls up lame. So this is the first kind of nationally advertised, reported on race, again attended by 100,000 people. You can kind of get the sense of the crowds of people here from this image sort of celebrating the race. This was seen as a challenge between regions, between North and South. Now, these challenges also play out between immigrants and native-born, and we can see this with boxing. So boxing in the United States in the 1840s is technically illegal in most places. Bare knuckle boxing, so they're not using gloves like we do in boxing today. Bare knuckle boxing was invented in England in the early 1700s by innovators like James Figg and Jack Broughton, who were the first to sort of make rules about how boxing should go. Boxing was hugely popular in England. It's a very democratic sport. Boxing was enjoyed by people of all social classes, and it was participated in by people of all social classes and races. So it's one of the few examples of American sports where it's consistently been integrated. It's as long as you can fight, as long as you're good, it doesn't matter what your social class or your skin color is. Boxing struggles to gain respectability in the United States, where it's oftentimes associated with street gangs and unruly immigrants, oftentimes Irish immigrants. The first known official boxing match in the United States took place in 1816, but with the wave of immigration of Irish immigrants in the 1840s, boxing starts to gain popularity in the United States. There are two really sort of popular boxers in the United States in the 1840s. Tom Hyer, who was a butcher based in New York City, the son of Jacob Hyer, who was actually one of the participants in the first documented boxing match in the United States. And Hyer was a boxer who was associated with the Native American gang in New York, which was a gang that was anti-immigrant. If you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, that's the gang, one of the gangs depicted in that film. The other major popular boxer in the 1840s in the United States was an immigrant, an Irish immigrant himself, named Yankee Sullivan. Now, his name was not actually Yankee Sullivan. He was born James Ambrose in Ireland. He had spent time boxing in England, but also engaging in some minor crimes. So he was actually shipped off to the penal colony in Australia, because Australia gets a start as a prisoner colony. He manages to get out of Australia, changes his name to Yankee Sullivan, goes back to England and reestablishes his street cred as a boxer before coming to the United States and bringing that cred with him. Sullivan was cheered on by many Irish immigrants, including the Dead Rabbits gang in New York City, which was led by Irish immigrants. He was also very popular amongst Tammany, which is a political machine in New York City, and in fact, at one point he worked for them. So these two were heavily hyped to eventually fight one another in a very similar way, if you're a boxing fan, to like Manny Pacquiao versus Floyd Mayweather. And like the Pacquiao-Mayweather fight, it took a while for Hyer and Sullivan to actually fight each other. They kind of circled around each other for a while, and then in 1848, they actually encountered one another at a bar and engaged in a barroom brawl, which brought these rival gangs in New York to the brink of all-out warfare on the streets. And so Hyer and Sullivan, to kind of calm things down, agreed to finally schedule their match. So Hyer and Sullivan organized the first official prize fight for the title of champion, American champion. But again, it had to take place illegally because boxing was outlawed in a lot of U.S. states. The sides agreed to terms. They agreed to keep the exact location secret, although it was going to be somewhere in Maryland, around Baltimore. In fact, they had to keep shifting where it was going to be located because the authorities were trying to arrest them for arranging this fight. And they set the fight prize at $10,000, which would be somewhere in the range of $250,000 to $300,000 today. So the two men will fight each other on February 7th, 1849, in bare knuckle boxing. It does not look like a fair fight on paper, and it did not turn out to be a very fair fight. Heyer was 5'11" and 200 pounds. So he had 3 inches and 40 pounds on Sullivan, who was only 5'8" and 160. So they were greatly mismatched in size. They went 16 rounds, with Heyer winning in 17 minutes, 18 seconds, or less than 10 actual minutes of fighting. So with that, Heyer becomes the first undisputed American champion boxer. And again, many people saw Heyer and Sullivan's fight as not simply a boxing match, but as a representation of this tension between native-born Americans and Irish immigrants. And so the Irish kind of saw Sullivan as their sort of representative for the might of the Irish. So sports continue past the Civil War to be really important for developing, excuse me, all kinds of social commentary and sort of proxies for more inborn conflicts. Boxing especially, given that it traditionally has been a fairly integrated sport. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, we're going to see the rise of boxer Jack Johnson, who Ken Burns has also made a documentary on. Again, that's a topic for History 1302. But Jack Johnson in particular is going to be very controversial because he's the first black heavyweight boxing champion in U.S. history, and he does not act like sort of the humble, kowtowing black man that people want him to be. So again, that's a story for History 1302, but do know that sports kind of continues this trend that we see before the Civil War as being both an important pastime for people to blow off steam, but also an important kind of area of social conflict for the United States.